We have to touch on this Kamala Harris thing because while everyone is sort of distracted and focusing on Biden's speech last night, it's not something that's particularly exciting for me to really take a deep dive into. But Kamala Harris's conversation with the Guatemalan government earlier this week really hits at a few different things: imperialism, a kind of liberal way of talking about the world's problems, a kind of way where you think if you name enough buzzwords, that the actual structural reality of crises goes away. Um, Actually, do we have that clip right now handy, Matt? I know we played it at the beginning, but for
Yep.
folks who are seeing this as a clip later, it's really worth watching again. This is Kamala Harris, who is talking to the president of Guatemala. The idea, the reason for this is because there is a humanitarian crisis at the U.S. border. Kamala Harris has now very notably refused to go and visit these detention facilities, as we are getting more and more reports that the conditions have not really improved there from the Trump administration. She's not going to the crisis point. As the vice president of the United States. Again, this is the task force that she has been put in charge of. They've made a big deal about how Kamala Harris is not just going to be a symbolic vice president, but is going to be very, very active in the United States, in U.S. policy. And this is her first major appointment. And she still has not come to Texas to see these facilities, which, as we've covered many times on this show, and most of you all are familiar with, are disaster zones. They are inhumane. The treatment is abhorrent. And there is a lot more that could be being done today. And they're still not doing it. Kamala Harris instead has said that she wanted to study the root causes of the migration and brought that up in a discussion with the president of Guatemala earlier this week.
There are also long-standing issues that are often called the root causes of immigration.
I just love the language, like long-standing issues, like just euphemisms that really just pad things out that don't really mean anything. Yeah. Oops, sorry, I lost my mouse here. There we go.
The root causes of immigration. We are looking at the issue of poverty and the lack, therefore, of economic opportunities, the issue of extreme weather conditions and the lack of climate adaptation, as well as corruption and the lack of good governance, and violence against women, indigenous people, LGBTQ people, and Afro-descendants.
Let's just take the first reaction because it's the right reaction. It takes a lot of gall to sit as the vice president of U.S. empire and to talk to people about anti-Black violence, anti-Indigenous violence, anti-LGBTQ violence, anti-women violence. It's exceptional and it's wrong. Not because the president of Guatemala is some kind of left-wing hero or anything like that, by the way, but because this is a country that has been bent to the will of U.S. empire for decades, to extreme devastation of the people who live there. So to act about these things like there's just these kind of questions of some abstract bigotry, for example, that just, invaded the population of Guatemala is absurd and it's despicable.
Yeah, right. It centers it in the people as if it's their sort of homophobia and misogyny and anti-Indigenous sort of feelings latent in the people themselves. And not as if like that stuff has been juiced for purposes of a political project to avoid like land reform.
Yeah, exactly. Well, to avoid land reform or any kind of alternative to capitalism. And like, it was very notable. And a lot of people make the point, it's like, she doesn't mention capitalism except in the absence, right? Except in like, poverty. And then, she doesn't mention imperialism, right? And a lot of folks have gone over the history of the United States coup, the U.S.-backed coup in Guatemala in the 1950s. Again, not even against the president who was some kind of radical lefty by any stretch of the imagination, but just somebody who wasn't wanting to toe an exact U.S. line. We then decided that we need to implement military dictatorship. And as Matt put in the opening sequence for this show, we're training the military there on how to do mass murder events. I mean, some of the most evil anti-human stuff you can imagine.
Yeah, mass graves like still being uncovered to this day. It's like a industry down there.
Yeah.
And
No,
then
it's
just
an
and just
industry.
lying about it. Like the State Department would just lie, saying, we've actually done our research. It's hard to know. Like Elliot Abrams hand waves, like it's hard to know. You only trust your sources. But we guess that on balance, it's probably the rebels who have been doing most of the violence. And actually, when they've done studies, just finding like bodies in mass graves with like 3 bullet holes in the back of the head. That the violence 99% of which, this shouldn't be a shock to anybody familiar with like Vincent Bevan's Jakarta method, right? Is from the of the anti-communist and the anti-indigenous, like just genocide folks.
No, exactly. And so there's so much history to talk about, but I wanted to take, this little brief amount of time that we have to talk about what's happening today, because this is a rhetorical strategy that we see, particularly from liberals, to use kind of like big buzzwords like racism or like anti-indigenous violence, anti-LGBTQ violence, to distract from what's actually happening on the ground. It's not, by the way, don't misunderstand me, that there isn't mass programs of anti-indigenous violence, mass programs of racist violence, mass programs of anti-LGBTQ and violence against women, right? It's that you use these words to sort of abstract from the forces that are creating these in the first place. So we'll get to that in just a second. First, I wanted to read from this piece. You could pull that up real quick, Matt, at NACLA.org. That sort of goes through what the Biden administration response to this humanitarian crisis has been so far. Meanwhile, harsh U.S. immigration policies continue to dehumanize and criminalize migrant children and families at the United States-Mexico border. Biden has continued to pressure Mexico and Guatemala to repress Central American migrants and caravans. And on April 12th, his administration reached an agreement to have these countries increase military presence at their borders. Despite promising to end family detention, Biden continues to imprison children and families in inhumane conditions. The United States also continues to support corrupt Central American presidents, such as Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, right, who has been implicated in narco trafficking. This is what the Biden administration is doing in response to this humanitarian crisis, right? It's continuing to pressure governments there to use the most repressive aspects of the state, right? The police and the military, to harass people, to intimidate people, to hurt people, and then to continue the terror that we are seeing in the U.S. today at the border. Right. I just wanted to bring that up when you hear Kamala talk about, failure of government in Guatemala or violence in Guatemala, that we're participating in those systems. Right. But I really wanted to focus on a couple of things. We hear about the need to defend Native peoples in the U.S., like in rhetoric, right? In Kamala's rhetoric. But what happens today in this country when the Apache are fighting to ensure that copper mines are not built on their lands through a process that will not only make their land inaccessible to them, but will sink the land around it, turning one of their most holy sites into a man-made crater to greed, right? So we hear all this talk about what's happening in Guatemala and anti-indigenous violence, but yet these systems are continuing in the United States today. And obviously there is no irony to talk about anti-Black violence, to come out of country to talk about anti-Black violence when we just saw a nationwide uprising to make sure that a murder of a Black man that was captured on video would not end in the acquittal of the murderer, right? But again, these things, we can do this with any kind of criticism the United States makes about other countries, because we do not have a perfect record when it comes to humanitarian issues, right? But let's talk really about what's going on in Guatemala and the U.S. relationship there. She promises here that there's going to be an increase in investment so that they can get to the root causes of the crisis. I wanted to mention that this term root causes is not unique to Kamala Harris, even though it might seem like it's some kind of like new development in ways of speaking liberal discourse. This goes back all the way to I'm sure it goes back much deeper, but in recent memory, this goes back 2014, when Joe Biden is put in charge, who was vice president then, of the Alliance for Prosperity, which was trying
Sounds fun.
to find a very fun alliance that helped a lot of great people, right? No, it was another one of these schemes where the US government says, we need to fight against systemic racism and anti-Indigenous violence in Central America to stop these migrations, right? And what happens? The United States talks a big game about, all of these structural issues, and then funds the police and the military. And then their investment to fight poverty essentially just lines the pockets of an already wealthy national bourgeoisie and is used to push forward another round of privatization, notably free markets, right? Pushing for free market neoliberalization. The history in these countries, particularly in Guatemala, but in Nicaragua and in Honduras, right, is the democratic transition from US-backed military regimes was predicated on neoliberal reforms, free trade, and utter suppression of the working class. And it created state models that were highly unequal and highly dependent on the United States. And that's something that has to be noted. So when you hear the United States is increasing their aid to countries, that's not necessarily meaning that things are getting better. These systems have been designed so that these countries are dependent on the United States for funding because the United States has pursued uneven development in those countries. As Michael Parenti famously said, there are not rich countries and poor countries. There are rich people and poor people. The United States is not interested in Guatemala because it is poor, but because it is rich. It is the national bourgeoisie and international capitalist class who are getting rich from pillaging the land in Guatemala. And when it comes to migration, when you extract all the capital from a country and it flows into the United States, when you push for free trade agreements, which means the resources and the money is all coming to the United States, of course you're going to get a flow of people, not because they want to leave their homes, but because it's difficult for them to maintain, a basic standard of living there. Talking about the root causes in Guatemala, in 2014, Obama again, spent all this money doing security training for Guatemala. And then what did much of the aid go to? It went to lining the pockets of wealthy bourgeoisie. It went to pushing for more and more privatization in these countries. And it also went to the expansion of the detention facilities that we note and rightfully critique Donald Trump on, right? Along with this push for free trade. But in the very last bit, I just wanted to focus on one thing that Kamala was talking about, which was anti-Indigenous violence in Guatemala, because that is very serious and people lose their lives every day and people are fleeing terror in that country. And what's so frustrating about the way that Kamala Harris is talking about what's happening there is not just, the irony of her lecturing a Guatemalan president on these issues, but the fact that she ignores the reason for these conflicts, the reason for these deaths, right? Maya people in Guatemala are brutally murdered and they face state terror and police violence. They face violence that is spurned and that is encouraged by US-backed transnational corporations that are doing what in the traditional lands of the Maya people there? They are trying to control the land for the production of palm oil. For folks who understand, that crop takes up a lot of space. It's extremely damaging, but it's also very profitable. Maya people are being murdered in their homes at the behest of people who are profiting from the palm oil industry. That is the engine that is what greases the wheels of the engine of death and destruction in that part of the world, right? It's the pursuit of profit for a few international capitalists to exploit and devastate the Maya people who have been fighting for their lands for centuries. This is not the first chapter in this fight, but this is what's happening. So when Kamala is, trying to talk about, the suffering of folks, right? We should challenge her to take her words seriously if she thinks this is a crisis and to start targeting the actual organizations that are behind this violence instead of just abstracting them away. So it's something that's immaterial and something that's deep in people's souls instead of something that is in people's bank accounts. And if they want to be serious about changing this dynamic, That's the kind of rhetoric and change that we would need to see.
Yeah, it's interesting that structural root causes is a lot like how Democrats are comfortable saying structural racism now. And it's like, what's that structure? Is it just the government you're talking about, or is it like the system of corporate capitalism to control all of like our material lives? Is that maybe what we want to address? And no, it's really what the insidious part of the messaging is that the problem we always say, or at least I keep peddling on about, which is like they're managers, they're not Democrats really, and they're more comfortable with that as a posture. So it's
well, because it's like it's a spiritual force.
Yes, yeah, exactly, and doesn't really challenge the setup of our relationship with Guatemala, for instance.